hand. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Annabelle Nunez. I'm here at the University of Arizona, and I will be your moderator for this session. I'm going to put into chat a couple of websites and information. If you have Twitter, there is the Twitter hashtag that you might want to use to share out. That would be terrific. I would like to thank you all again for joining us for this presentation. The title is Roadblocks in Partnerships, Teaching Faculty, Librarians, and the Implementation of Critical Information Literacy Pedagogy. Today's presenters are Amandajean Nolte, whose pronouns are she, her. She is the Humanity Librarian at the University of Northern Iowa. We also have Angela Pratesi. Preferred pronouns are she, her. She is head librarian of the Music Library and Bill Shirk Sound Archives at the Bowling Green State Library University. And we also have Angie Cox. Pronouns are she, her, and she is the instruction and liaison librarian at the University of Northern Arizona. Okay, and with that, I will turn it over to our presenters.
Welcome. We're so happy you're here with us today. As Annabelle said, I am Amandajean Nolte, pronouns she, her, hers, and I'm currently the humanities librarian at UNI. Prior to becoming a librarian, I kind of moved into librarianship in my 30s. I actually was a communication studies instructor and the director of a social justice forum theater troupe. Shout out to Augusto Boal and Theater of the Oppressed Work.
My name is Angela Pratesi. I'm the head librarian of the Music Library and Bill Shirk Sound Archives at the University of, I'm going into my old title, right, at Bowling Green State University. Prior to coming to BGSU, I was the Fine and Performing Arts librarian at the University of Northern Iowa, which is where I met these fine people. And my pronouns are she, her.
And I am Angie Cox. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the instruction liaison librarian from the University of Northern Iowa.
To get us started, the University of Northern Iowa honors the ancestral stewards of the land on which our university rests. Among these stewards are the Iowa, Sauk, Fox, Sioux, Omaha, and Ho-Chunk, as well as those tribal nations who are contemporary caretakers of land in Iowa, including the Meskwaki, Sac, and Fox tribe of the Mississippi and Iowa. We acknowledge the sovereignty of your tribal nations and the violent and painful histories of removal and dispossession as the original caretakers of the land. Through the work we do every day to live our mission, the University of Northern Iowa aspires for you to see a community that honors Native and Indigenous peoples and culture, lives the 7th generation principle, does good for the people and communities we serve, embraces stewardship of our mission and land. As a public university committed to the people and communities of Iowa, the University of Northern Iowa is proud to honor you as the original caretakers of the land on which our faculty, staff, and students deliver our mission to create a strong, vibrant, and inclusive state in the present and for generations to come.
Bowling Green State University is affiliated and its affiliated campuses are situated in the homelands of numerous Indigenous and Native tribal nations. Our campus footprint holds many contemporary and historical ties to the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Odawa, Potawatomi, and multiple other Indigenous tribal nations, present and past, who were forcibly removed to and from the area. This area's history reveals an arterial network of complex economic and cultural significance. We recognize the stewardship, dedication, and presence of those for whom the Great Black Swamp and the Lower Great Lakes region is home. Through this statement, we aim to trace the past to the present to inform current conditions.
The three of us, as scholars and teachers, recognize the work of the Native Governance Center, who reminds us that true solidarity includes donating time and money to Indigenous-led organizations, amplifying the voices of Indigenous people, leading grassroots change movements, and returning the land. So today, we all come into this space from our unique physical and emotional spaces. I personally am in my work office, which is cozy and conducive to deep thinking, but not always an energetic and creative space for me. Emotionally, I'm excited to be at CLAPS this week, but feeling pulled in multiple directions as a virtual conference made it difficult for me to feel like I could block my whole day for reflection and learning. And yes, I will have to unpack that expectation at some point. Whether right or wrong, however, I am balancing many hats and responsibilities and feeling the pull of multitasking and busyness. If I had to choose an emoji to embody how I'm feeling right now, I might choose this one. If you are willing and able, please choose an emoji representing how you feel about your readiness and willingness to learn and engage this afternoon. Those emojis should be under the reactions tab in your Zoom bar, which might actually be under the more functionality. So we'll take a couple seconds for people to look at those. As we all can see, we are entering this created space with a lot on our minds and on our hearts. We recognize your physiological and emotional state will affect your ability to be present today, and we ask you to recognize that as well. Where you are is fine, and it's helpful for us all to be aware of our availability for learning and conversation today. Angela, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
All right, thank you, AJ. Our path today is in 3 parts. We'd like to begin by sharing our process, followed by the study we conducted, and then the robust critical inquiry that followed. So let's dive in. Our talk today mirrors our process of information creation and strategic inquiry. Most previous studies examining questions of faculty perceptions of information literacy were completed between 2000 and 2015, when the information literacy competency standards were the official guiding document from ACRL. There are a few newer studies that do consider the ACRL framework. We wanted to see if the findings in these previous studies were similar on our campus, and by our campus, I'm referring to University of Northern Iowa, which was where we began this work. So on our campus, to help us understand how much our teaching faculty colleagues were familiar with the concepts in the ACRL framework, and thus inform our approach to collaboration and praxis as critical librarians. One of the challenges of studies like these is that they are limited to a particular time and place. They account for local practice, knowledge, and attitudes, which may or may not be accurate reflections of our campuses, all of ours, for many reasons. Previous studies asked similar questions to our early questions. The 5 listed on this slide, Burry 2011, Dawes 2019, Dubicki 2013, Moran 2019, and Saunders 2012, heavily influenced our thinking and initial inquiry. There are many, many others out there, but these were the ones that were most important to us in our early process. And that process has been iterative. We started by asking more straightforward questions, and we got some answers, some actionable answers even. As we dug deeper into our own interests and our own praxis, we realized we had and have more and different and new questions. In a moment of metacognitive reflection, we realized we were working through the frames, and specifically at this point in the process, searching a strategic exploration, and perhaps even more importantly, research as inquiry. And that is a theme that we realized was following us throughout our process. During the first phase of inquiry about faculty perceptions of information literacy on our campus, we conducted a mixed method study using a survey instrument that produced quantitative and qualitative data. I scrolled too far, hold on. There, all right. So first, some good news. It's always nice to have some good news, right? Resoundingly, every faculty respondent values information literacy, 100%. Lovely, a lovely number to have. We found that faculty librarian collaboration is happening in many forms at the University of Northern Iowa. That's all great news. And resounding successes in terms of numbers. So now I'm going to turn it over to Angie to talk about the perhaps unsurprising disconnect we found between how teaching faculty understand information literacy and the ways librarians frame these intersecting concepts and skills.
Thanks, Angela. So yes, we found a problem of understanding exists in the definition of information literacy itself. And the difference was seen as faculty shared examples of their learning outcomes through our survey mechanism. And in our analysis of those responses, we found that faculty align more with standards language rather than the framework language. We also found that they use critical thinking and information literacy synonymously. This finding is consistent with previous studies on this topic, so we weren't completely surprised by that latest finding on critical thinking. But for the purposes of our study, we coded critical thinking responses as not IL because we as researchers, as librarians, recognize that information literacy is a component of critical thinking, but they are not necessarily synonymous with one another. Ultimately, we found that our data backs up our own experience and frustrations and highlights a roadblock in the partnership between librarians and instructors of record. Later on in this presentation, I'm going to problematize our findings about defining information literacy, but for now, I will let AJ tell us how that leads us into practice.
Sure. So this theoretical problem of understanding led to disagreement on the specific instructional interventions that support student information literacy skill development. In surveying our faculty at this institution, we found that 88% require the use of information sources in their undergraduate courses. But only 68% teach information literacy in those same courses. Perhaps not surprisingly then, 77% of respondents believe their students demonstrate information literacy inconsistently for their undergraduate status. So our study really showed reliance on information sources to support teaching and learning, but 1/3 of the faculty do not pair that reliance with instruction support. In the 2/3 of classrooms where information literacy instruction is happening, it's taught by both faculty of record and librarian collaborators. The top 5 IL topics that faculty report teaching or having librarians teach, so these are the most hot topics, are citing, search techniques, authority of source type, plagiarism, and research process and peer review tied for 5th on that list. These rankings align with similar studies that identified faculty prioritize evaluation and plagiarism as the most essential information literacy skills for students to learn. So I mentioned that this was coming about whether it was from faculty or librarians. So we also asked faculty, when you teach information literacy, what are you teaching? And in that list, citing, plagiarism, authority of source types, search techniques, and research process rose to the surface. And the top 5 topics they report they have a librarian come in to teach are search techniques, authority of source type, citing, peer review, and specific sources. Now, these are long lists, and you can see them on the screen, but there are 2 things that we want to point out. So first, Plagiarism is the only topic in the top 5 that faculty report teaching themselves that does not appear in the top 5 for librarian instruction. So there's something there about ownership over that content. In addition, specific sources is the top 5 topic that faculty report having a librarian teach that is not in the top of their own instructional content. And this finding led us to conclude that when a librarian is asked into a class, if you look at what is shared here, the topics being requested align more with skills than habits of mind. Now, our study did not ask librarians what they actually taught when coming into these teaching situations, but that would be an interesting further study. Angela will tell us how these relatively straightforward findings led us to some bigger picture questions.
All right, thank you. So that's always the big question. So what? Why did what we find matter? Well, it turns out our initial inquiries appear to be a nice preamble to a perhaps different project. As I guess that sometimes does happen. It led us to many lively, reflective, invigorating, and sometimes quite depressing conversations. We saw how our findings were in conversation with previous studies and pointed toward the need for further research. We also saw how our findings spurred our own conversations with each other, deepening our questions and often requiring us to approach the problem in different ways. As scholars, the limitations of this kind of study begs for future research using different research designs. It's useful if you want to know what's happening on your campus. What we learned is similar to some studies, different from others, and highlights the importance of our local circumstances. In terms of our praxis as critical instruction librarians, we have some useful takeaways that we can begin acting on. However, that local practice is important. My own transition to a new institution in the middle of our analysis anecdotally shed light on how the local norms and campus culture impacts our experiences as librarians at our own institutions. It's easy for us to take for granted how similar or even the same we may think our experiences are compared to other campuses and even our subject areas. Those contexts can create widely varying differences. That's not a bad thing. It's just different and worth explicitly surfacing in the context of studies like this one. Now, we'd like to take a moment to reflect. One of our favorite things to do, right? Since we know local context matters, we'd like everyone to check in with themselves briefly and answer the question, how does what we have shared so far align or differ from your own experiences? So what's similar and what's different? You can make notes for yourself or simply make a mental note. And I'm going to set a timer for about 45 seconds. So check in. All right, that's 45 seconds. That reflection, that mini moment of formative assessment was for you and you alone as a way to engage personally and internally. Now that you've checked in with yourself, let's turn our attention to how these findings can impact our everyday praxis as critical instruction librarians, or put another way, what critical inquiries we derived as a result of the study. So that very first really wonderful news. We know that faculty value information literacy and that collaboration is happening. But is it really valuing information literacy if we are not examining power structures and developing habits of mind? And is it a true collaboration if one person is in service to the other rather than in equal partnership? It is possible, even likely, that the different definitions of information literacy that faculty and librarians use are a root cause for an overly facile approach to understanding increasingly complex information systems. At the same time, we recognize and critique power structures in information. We are existing within a system that inherently suppresses our own expertise and agency as highly trained and skilled teachers. Teaching faculty are our colleagues and allies. They can even be our champions and advocates. But that does not change the fact they're also functionally gatekeepers, which makes mutual respect and partnership all the more important. And now I'm going to turn it over to Angie.
I had to remember to unmute. Think this far into pandemic, we would remember to do that, right? So when we're looking at that problem of understanding, again, at the definition level, I think it's important to remember that definitions are foundational to joint understanding. And if we aren't ever on the same page with basic skills and definitions, true critical information literacy is difficult to achieve. In addition to that, we are often butting up against institutional mechanisms like assessment, which may use different definitions and different assessment tools. At UNI, the value rubric, which aligns with standards, is used to assess our general education program. Now, whether or not our participants teach in the general ed or not, many of them said they don't use the value rubric and relied on something else completely. This percentage breakdown of the learning outcomes when we coded based on the standards. And I want you to focus in on the find bar there, where it says 25% of the learning outcomes cover finding sources. And I point this out for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, I think this is often our foot in the door to the classroom. The database demo request, right? I call it the dog and pony show sometimes. I think that the skill of finding is so foundational or fundamental that maybe it doesn't arise to the level of a learning outcome. This could mean many things, including a disposition that librarians are providing a service rather than partnering in teaching. It also opens the door for less development of robust finding skills, since they are not a goal and appear not to be assessed. Now, find can be tricky, right, to assess, which is also just an additional compounding factor in all of this. Regardless, it is certainly an area to drill down further into for further study. Now, this slide shows the representative statements and how we coded them based on the standards and the framework. When we were coding for the standards, find, evaluate, and use, it was easier to do or assess. And when we were doing the framework coding, it indicates that the habits of mind and dispositions in the framework are not necessarily accessible in student work. Now, backward design tells us that learning outcomes and assessment must guide and inform instruction. If information literacy is not built into the rubric or course goals, it is undermining the value of that work within the systems that we work. Now, the challenge for us as librarians becomes one of instructing the teaching faculty and their students, sometimes at the same time. And without bringing teaching faculty along, the depth and breadth of critical information literacy and the corresponding goals of using critical pedagogical methods cannot be fully realized. Now, AJ is going to expand on these issues as they relate to instructional interventions.
So this disagreement on the specific instructional interventions that support student information literacy skill development is exacerbated by who has power to make the instruction decisions for a classroom of students. Are librarians active participants in the community of learners, or are we viewed as authority figures, but authority figures of very specific topics running parallel to the classroom content decided on by the faculty member of record? As we combed through our findings, we began to see on paper why our instruction often felt futile and confined. If we're being asked to come in for task-based skills development, is there space for more robust information literacy as well as critical pedagogical methods? As teachers and researchers on this study, we want a both and. We recognize the importance of skills and tasks as necessary to engaging with information systems, but we also know that the systems will continue to change, and what we need to foster are independent thinkers and engaged voices. As bell hooks reminds us, a radical space of possibility allows movement against and beyond. Perhaps the hardest finding for us to reckon with as we analyzed our study was a realization that as our field has become more complex, it seems our faculty continue to uncomplicate information literacy and ask us to prioritize issues of information that shortcut the messiness. If a librarian comes in and tells students how to search appropriate sources for a discipline, there is less room and time to problematize these very systems and source types. Critical pedagogy is a method, and in our case, a method we bring into another faculty member's classroom that already has established norms and rules and values. Larger goals for lifelong learning and community membership can come in conflict with faculty expectations for their course and their assignment. When faculty require certain kinds of materials to the exclusion of others, they are oversimplifying and providing a workaround checklist for authority, leaving no space for the important second half of that frame, which says authority is constructed and contextual. And this shortcut can leave students with no critical understanding of authority beyond some sources are good and some are bad as determined by these experts, the faculty member and or the librarian. When faculty are asking us to come in to talk about citing, or they themselves talk about plagiarism, we know that it is often through a lens of punishment and confinement rather than a place of promise or possibility. And while citation practices may indicate that information has value, they're better understood and demystified when understood as a communication tool in a community of practice. They're how new scholars communicate in the scholarship as conversation across time and systems. And we started to question and discuss with each other if plagiarism was the most effective way to teach that value of information, or if there was a place where a librarian could deepen this conversation by including more complex conversations about information access, privilege, and maybe even expense. While working with these findings, we began to ask ourselves, are we empowered in our institutions and on our campuses to say no? And does it depend on our positionality, classification at our institution, place on the tenure track, or status as a staff member? Do we all have the right to refuse or propose another possibility? In so many ways, the characteristics of the critical classrooms that we desire to create are the same characteristics we desire in our faculty partnerships, a place to coexist, imagine, and critically interrogate. So critical classrooms attempt to flatten that hierarchy of power. They allow space for lived experiences, both ours and our students. And our respondents believe our students demonstrate information literacy inconsistently for their undergraduate status. But if we aren't meeting students where they are, we may be asking students to do work they're not prepared to do. And this further will disadvantage students who come from backgrounds that did not or could not provide this type of library instruction pre-college. With this realization, however, we also recognize the challenges of offering this instruction, including difficulties of prioritizing class content and class time, in addition to general labor challenges in higher education that are a contributing factor, such as service and scholarship pressures, the competitive ego drive of academics, precarity, or the ever-increasing workload for a shrinking workforce. Now, while these realizations can feel heavy and perhaps Sisyphean, we did not leave this research project without hope.
So let's try for a little hope here. And so given where we were in this project and thinking about what we can do, right, and applying what we've learned and actually showing this at our institutions and in our classrooms, we came up with some ideas, some takeaways. And they probably all fall under making a plan, right? And thinking about how you're going to manage either relationships or your opportunities. And so when we think about managing your relationships, building those relationships, librarians have to build meaningful relationships with faculty. And this sometimes means for introverts like myself, right, that I have to show up and I actually have to talk with people and follow through and check in further with people, right? But recognizing that there are limitations of time and resources to do this work well. Also keep in mind that you are an advocate. You are an advocate for critical information literacy in every space that you enter. And part of being an advocate is to educate the allies and other advocates who will be in the spaces when you aren't present. Now, when we flip over to opportunities, keeping in mind that this is a long game. These strategies take an exceptional amount of time and practice and guidance to get better. And in some ways, we are continually trying to improve these, right? So it's a long game. It'll take time. The other piece is to have your pitch ready, right? And have your idea ready, but wait for a moment. And waiting for your moment and realizing and talking to those when they are open and they are willing to listen. So waiting for your moment. Also, in talking about pitch, considering your pitch, considering how you talk about this, and considering what you can do in the classroom, and recognizing that your rhetorical choices matter. One example that actually relates to some work that I've done. I've actually done this with a faculty member that was resistant, right? It's a resistant faculty member that I've worked with for several semesters in the classroom. And I went to them prior to the class when it came back and said, hey, I need you to come back in this semester. I said, you know, I've been noticing that students really seem to be struggling with X in the class. And I really want to try to tweak what I'm doing in the classroom to address that, maybe try X, Y, Z. So if you see that, just be aware that that's what I'm trying to go for. And my hope was that this would give them a heads up as if I'm changing my approach a little bit, but also it provides them hopefully with a rationale of what I'm trying to do and kind of broaden their mind as to what these critical skills are. Finally, recognizing risk. There is risk in this. AJ talked about the risk of saying no. And in this sense, the risk in setting a precedent, if you can't, or maybe you don't want to sustain, right? Keeping in that tension that this is important work, but recognizing the limitations that you may have to do this work well, kind of see above, right? So with that in mind, what we kind of want to do here before we head to questions is to give you a little time to reflect and actually share out. And so maybe you saw or heard something that we said as a takeaway or a strategy that you want to use. Or maybe you yourself have found a strategy that really works well in the classroom. And so we want to give you, I'm going to give you about a minute. I have a clock too. I'll give you about a minute and I want you to share your answer in the chat. Again, one thing you'd like to try or something that you have tried to address the challenges that we spoke of earlier. Okay, so I'll give you about a minute here and just fill up that chat as you have it. Yes, the prompt is something that you want to try that maybe we mentioned here at the takeaway slide, or maybe something that you have tried that you found worked really well to address the challenges. I'm going to also put it in the chat. I should have thought of that ahead of time. My apologies for that. Oh, there you go, AJ. That's why I adore her. Thanks so much. And that is time. So AJ and Angela, is there anything in the chat? I know I'm putting you on the spot totally. We didn't practice this part. Is there anything in particular that you saw in the chat
So I give them
that jumped out?
Let's give them 30 more seconds. Some people were typing more than just a couple of words. And so I think people have things formulated, but haven't been able to hit enter yet.
Perfect.
Does
Just
that
give
make
it a little
sense?
more time.
Yes.
And I'll spend that time a little bit here. Help me, friends, to stay on track. And actually, while they're doing that, Annabelle, I actually have a question. Will we get the chat transcript?
Yes, I believe so.
So what I think I'd like to do, and I'm offering this for our group of presenters, what I think I'd like to do once we get that transcript, what we will do as presenters is put these responses, if you're willing, on a Google Doc, and we will add that link to our slide deck. Just as an additional ideas, because some of these that I'm reading here are really good that I would like to, and I don't want to lose, right? And so for some reason you've shared something, you're like, oh, no, I wish I had that back. Just say, please take mine off or whatever. But if that's amenable to everyone, that's what we'd like to do. That way you don't have to keep track of all of these great ideas. We'll do that for you. Yes. Instructor development. Yes. Faculty development. I love that.
I'm seeing a lot of theme here of places where folks seem to feel empowered, right? And a place where you feel that control, but also some people pointing out that the longer they've been in their careers, the more empowered they feel to say no to certain things, to be able to say that's outside the scope of what we do or what I do or what I'm willing to do, kind of a piece.
This is really great. I would say, if you have more ideas, keep putting them in the chat. But what I'd kind of like to do really quickly in closing is saying thank you. Recognizing that all of this has implications for what we are able to do in practice and what we are able to do at our own individual institutions. And so I speak on the behalf of AJ and Angela today. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your presence in this space today. And I would like to open us up to questions that we might have.